If you live in the western United States, you are painfully aware that everything is on fire.
As the West battles deadly wildfires, nearly 40 fires burning across 9 states.
And over the 4th of July weekend, there was a ton of press releases being put out by cities and counties canceling fireworks and placing heavy fire restrictions on everything. And if you're like me, you may have noticed that all of these fires have been getting worse and worse year after year. But what if I told you these fires aren't solely the fault of people setting off fireworks or not dousing their campfires, but years of government mismanagement and one of the most well-known ad campaigns of all time? Yeah, today we're talking about Smokey Bear. Alright, from the top, we all know Smokey Bear, or Smokey the Bear if you're from the different timeline, that ad campaign that copies the old Uncle Sam poster of pointing and saying, "Only you can prevent wildfires." Few people understand where this ad campaign came from and why it was so important at the time it was introduced. To understand this, we have to do what we do with every modern day story: go back to World War II. Actually, just a little bit further back than that, to 1910, when the single largest wildfire incident in US history burned 3 million acres of forest across Montana, Idaho, and Washington in just 2 days. Following this event, those in leadership across multiple agencies, including the National Forest Service and other regional agencies, believed that only total fire suppression could be the answer to preventing something like this from happening again. So the Forest Service and these other fire prevention agencies expanded to better fight forest fires across the country and keep something like this from happening again, and they pushed heavily for total fire prevention. These efforts helped lead to the expansion of wildland firefighting as its own profession, and men everywhere took up the job. Fast forward to World War II, 1939, Germany and Russia invade Poland, starting the war in Europe, but America doesn't really want to get involved. Fast forward again, December 1941, Japan commits the 8th deadly sin, attacking America's boats, meaning America is going to war. And America sends a ton of men to fight in World War II. 16 million able-bodied young men shipped off to Europe and the Pacific to defend the title as World War champions. And we've all seen the movies of brave men bravely sacrificing themselves to win the battle and save the world. But what we don't see a lot of in those movies is what life is like back home. Back home in the States, all these jobs that were being filled by these young men were suddenly vacant. Factories were able to appeal to the patriotism to get women to fill jobs on assembly lines to help build a ton of tanks and planes that we used for the war. You've got Rosie the Riveter inspiring women to help in the war effort. But there were certain jobs that couldn't be filled by women to that degree as the factory work was. One of those jobs was wildland firefighting. In fact, there was an option for men who were firefighters to actually skip the draft because they were considered a necessity back home. But a ton of young men didn't want to do that because they felt they had a duty to go fight in the war, meaning that the country is now understaffed when it came to these firefighters. And this is where Smokey comes in. The United States Forest Service, along with the broader federal government, knew that with most of the experienced firefighters fighting in the war, the chance of a wildfire getting out of control was higher than ever, and they would have to spend a ton of money that should be going to the war fighting these fires instead. So they started ad campaigns telling the American people that forest fires would only help the enemy, and we don't want that happening because at this point in the war, we weren't really sure if we were going to win. Then in 1944, the government parted with Disney. Yeah, that Disney, and made fire prevention posters featuring Bambi and his friends, and this proved to be way more successful than any of the other ads. Seeing the success of the Bambi ad, the government is like, we figured it out. If we use actual people, nobody cares, but these cute animals get everybody's attention. We need a cute animal of our own. And that's exactly what they do. In 1944, they released the first Smokey Bear ad with a bear dressed as a park ranger with the iconic hat, and it went whatever the 1940s version of viral is. And over the next couple of years, the ads keep coming out, even after the men returned from World War II, because he was just that popular, and the ad campaign seemed to be working on preventing these fires. Then in 1947, Smokey would be given his now iconic catchphrase, "Only you can prevent forest fires," which would later be changed to "Only you can prevent wildfires," following a series of severe wildfires outside of natural forests in 2001. And Smokey still exists to this day, showing up on TV, streaming services, and even social media, constantly reminding you that only you can prevent wildfires. And this is where the problems start, because now when they say "only you," they mean it. Now, I'm not here to trash on the hardworking men and women of the National Forest Service. Y'all are some of my favorite people, and your dedication to the natural beauty of this nation and the safety of its people is unmatched. I will, however, trash on the leadership in government at the state and federal levels who have failed to recognize the problem wildfires now represent. Now, have you noticed how wildfires have actually gotten insanely worse in the last few years? Like, several states have had their largest fires in state history in the last 5 years. A lot of this is due to how wildfires burn and spread. Alright, remember in science class they taught you that fire needs 3 things: oxygen, fuel, and an ignition source? Well, in the case of wildfires, the oxygen is everywhere because it's outside. The ignition source can be all kinds of things, from lightning strikes to a cigarette butt or an undoused campfire. And in the case of fuel sources, it can include bushes, fallen or standing dead trees, leaves, grass, you name it. And in undisturbed nature, a fire will come through and burn an area, thus removing all the dead timber, brush, and leaves from that area, allowing new trees, grass, bushes, and everything else to grow anew and replenish the ecosystem. Well, what Smokey Bear did was help to drastically reduce the ignition source by almost eliminating fires started by man. And the government looked at the reduction in overall fires and said, "Mission accomplished, no need to change anything, we're going to continue this because this should work forever." However, as the years have gone by, this has allowed more and more fuel sources to stack up, especially in areas where plants that grow on the forest floor or in these wildland areas lose leaves or die each year, meaning that years of growth, lost leaves, and dead plants have stacked up and created the recipe for what is now being called mega fires. Back before the Forest Service, BLM, and fire prevention, the fires that burned the little amounts of grass and dead shrub would burn fast and only burn the bark off of the standing, living trees. After the fire burned out, the tree would grow new bark and continue to grow as if nothing happened, only a small scar in its rings to serve as a memory of that fire. But the increase in fuel on the forest floor has led to the living trees becoming fuel for the fire itself, taking fires from a relatively minor fire that burns quickly through grass to a raging inferno that turns the entire forest into an oven that consumes everything: bushes, trees, animals, houses, and people. And because the fire completely consumes the trees and scorches the earth, it destroys the nutrients in the soil and even makes it hydrophobic. Pair this with the fact that the fire burns through the root systems of the trees, that you are left with ground that can't support new growth of trees and other plants and is more prone to erosion since it doesn't have the root system holding it all together. Meaning that in the coming years, the areas that have had these mega fires are likely to experience heavy erosion, and if they get a bunch of rain, mudslides. Meaning that the Smokey Bear ad campaign could literally be reshaping the geology and topography of the United States. And the thing is, this isn't new information. We've understood how fires work for quite a long time. The government just saw that educating people to not start fires was effective at keeping them from spending a ton of money on fighting fires, and they just kept doing it. But it's been almost a century since then, and now we've discovered that we aren't stopping fires, we just postponed them and created bigger ones. And now the spending that's done on fighting these fires is absolutely insane. Fighting these mega fires costs billions of dollars a year. And because it's been decades at this point, the problem of huge fuel buildup is a very difficult one to solve, especially when it becomes political. I don't really want to get into the insane level of politicking that occurs between Donald Trump and Gavin Newsom. They both make stupid decisions and play on the hate the American people have for each of them, and ultimately nothing gets done. However, Trump's calls for California to work on reducing fuels in California-owned forests and Newsom's refusing to do so without federal funding is absolutely ridiculous, and further mismanagement leads to devastating personal losses like the Palisades fire, which was all just a land grab opportunity for the elites to buy cheaper land that they could then build housing complexes on, spike rent prices, and ensure that the housing crisis in California continues forever. But if the government isn't going to fix the problem of overstocked fuels, I guess it's up to the people, right? Kinda. I grew up in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, and one of the big issues in those mountains is beetle kill. Pine beetles, these demonic douchebags, get under tree bark and kill the tree from the inside. After killing one tree, they move on to the next, and it becomes an outbreak that spreads through huge swaths of the forest. Well, growing up in those mountains, there were a ton of dead trees because of these beetles. And you would think that because these dead trees pose a giant fire threat, the Forest Service would let the locals, who would use the wood for fires in their homes because it gets 40 below zero in the winter, go cut them down for free. It's a win-win. Nope, they don't do that. Instead, you have to buy a permit, and they charge you based on the amount of wood you collect, and you're only allowed to collect so much within a year. And even if hundreds of locals did that, once they reached their limits, it would be so far away from solving the problem. So not only is the government not fixing the problem that they took responsibility for with the founding of the Forest Service, but they also won't let you solve it either. And this gets me to my next point that I want to make about Smokey. Thanks to Smokey Bear, we as a society have come to believe that all fire is bad. And to be honest, a lot of fire is bad. Your house is on fire, that's bad. These raging inferno forest fires, also bad. But if you grew up around agriculture like I did, you probably know that burning crop fields before planting new crops is a good thing. It not only removes old crop, but also reintroduces nutrients back into the soil for the next crop. It's the same way for these forests. But most people don't know that, and believe me, I work in a call center and we get tons of calls every year from people calling about farmers burning the fields, and these people who don't know what the hell they're talking about want us to go out and arrest farmers because fire bad. And these prescribed burns that farmers do are something we should be doing to thin out fuels in these forest and wildland areas. But because people are so conditioned to believe that all fire is bad, as soon as you suggest doing that in a forest, people will lose their minds. Which is one of the biggest reasons that I will always push for agricultural education and advocate that people get out there and learn about nature. Because the Native Americans who didn't know how to use the wheel understood prescribed burning better than most Americans do today. And being fair, the Forest Service still does prescribed burning, but it accounts for a minute fraction of the money spent on fire prevention, which in itself is a fraction that we spend on fighting fires. And to me, it's just a textbook example of the idea that an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure, but I think we're at the point where we need a lot of pounds of prevention. And with recent restructuring and budget changes, I'm not sure the Forest Service is going to be able to keep up, and I worry that these fires are going to keep getting worse and worse because we are beyond the point of fire prevention being only our responsibility. And it's just a reminder that even the best intentions, if not adapting and changing to new information, can lead to a literal hell where everything is on fire, the air isn't safe to breathe, people are losing their homes and dying, and the government is still stealing your money and telling you that it's your fault and try to further restrict your lives because they can't admit their own screw-ups and change. And that makes me really sad because when you look back at these guys who were reacting to the big burn in 1910, they were only going off the information and resources they had and decided that prevention was the only way forward. But now it's over 100 years later and we are still thinking that the same solution is going to work when we have a ton of information that suggests we need to change. And I just don't really see that happening to the degree it needs to, and it pisses me off. I know that there are going to be people that say, nah man, it's global warming that's causing these fires. All right, maybe warmer temperatures are leading to more fires starting, but the severity of the fires would be lessened if we got rid of these heavy fuel sources. The Forest Service knows this, but again, the government isn't taking steps to actually solve the problem before it starts, rather just reacting to it when it happens. Like, at some point, we as a people have to look at our government and say, screw you, we aren't going to let your policies destroy our beautiful country and your petty rivalries prevent change. I know that there are people within the government and within the Forest Service who care and want to solve this problem, but they get silenced and overridden by these entrenched politicians who don't care about green forests and grass. The only green they care about is money. How am I getting this pissed off on a video about Smokey Bear? Like, it sucks to see that something that myself and people like me that always thought was a pretty good idea, preventing forest fires, and see that the government screwed that up too. And that is the story of the Smokey Bear ad campaign. The ad campaign that had the opposite effect of what was intended and actually increased the destruction of wildfires. Thank you for watching. If you're a firefighter or have family that are, I pray you stay safe this summer and thank you for your service. The end.